Thomas Bridger found the child at first light, half buried in sand where the arroyo bent north. A girl, no more than 6 years old, her small body curled tight against the cold. Her lips were blue. Her breathing came shallow and ragged. The tracks around her told a story Thomas didn't want to read. Unshod hooves, many of them moving fast. Rifle shots that had kicked up dirt in 3 different places. Someone had been running. Someone had been chasing. And this child had been left behind, either by accident or desperation. Thomas knelt beside her, touching her shoulder gently. She didn't wake. He lifted her carefully, feeling how light she was, how fragile. Her clothes were traditional Apache, deerskin decorated with small glass beads that caught the morning sun. Her dark hair was matted with dust and blood from a shallow cut above her ear. Thomas carried her to his horse and mounted up, holding her against his chest. She stirred once, a small sound escaping her throat, then went still again. He turned toward home and rode hard. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by juniper and pinyon pine, 15 miles from the nearest settlement. Thomas had built it himself after the war, needing distance from everything he'd seen, everything he'd done. The land was poor for farming, but good for solitude. He kept a few goats, some chickens, a vegetable garden that struggled in the thin soil. It was enough. He'd learned to live with enough rather than plenty. He carried the child inside and laid her on his own bed, covering her with 2 wool blankets. Her skin was cold to the touch, her pulse weak but steady. Thomas built up the fire until the cabin grew warm, then heated water and searched through his meager supplies for anything that might help. He had flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, no medicine beyond whiskey and a tin of salve he used on the goats when they got scraped up. He dampened a cloth and cleaned the cut on her head, working carefully. The wound wasn't deep, already starting to scab. Whatever had happened to her, she'd been lucky in that much at least. Thomas sat in the chair beside the bed and watched her breathe. He should have been asking himself what to do next, should have been planning how to find her people, how to return her safely, but his mind kept catching on simpler things, the small rise and fall of her chest. The way her fingers curled slightly, even in sleep. How young she was, how alone. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, pouring light through the single window. Thomas made coffee, drank it standing by the stove. He checked the girl every few minutes, adjusting the blankets, feeling her forehead for fever. None came. By midday she started to stir, small movements at first, then her eyes opened. They were dark, wide with confusion and fear. She saw Thomas and went rigid, pressing herself back against the wall, breathing fast. Thomas raised both hands slowly, palms out. He didn't speak. Words wouldn't help, not if she didn't understand English, not when she was terrified. He stayed where he was, not moving, letting her see that he wasn't reaching for a weapon, wasn't coming closer. The girl stared at him, her eyes darting around the cabin, taking in the unfamiliar space, the closed door, the fire crackling in the hearth. Thomas pointed to himself, then to the water bucket by the door. He mimed drinking, then pointed to her. The girl didn't respond. Thomas stood slowly, moving with exaggerated care, and filled a tin cup with water. He set it on the floor halfway between them, then backed away to his chair. The girl watched him for a long moment. Then, moving quickly, she scrambled forward, grabbed the cup, and retreated to the bed. She drank in desperate gulps, water spilling down her chin. When the cup was empty, she held it against her chest and stared at Thomas again. He pointed to the cup, then to the bucket, silently offering more. The girl hesitated, then extended the cup toward him, arms stretched as far as it would reach without leaving the bed. Thomas took it, refilled it, and placed it back on the floor. This time she came forward more slowly, took the cup and drank. She didn't retreat as far. Progress. Thomas returned to his chair. The girl sat on the edge of the bed, holding the empty cup, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She said something in Apache, a question he couldn't understand. Thomas shook his head, pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said quietly. The girl repeated the word, her pronunciation careful, testing it. "Thomas." Then she pointed to herself and said something he couldn't quite catch. He tried repeating it, but knew immediately he'd gotten it wrong. The girl almost smiled, a tiny movement at the corner of her mouth, then said it again, slower. "Nalin." Thomas repeated it. This time she nodded. Nalin. It was a beginning. The rest of the day unfolded in small, careful steps. Thomas made cornbread and beans, the only food he knew how to prepare that might appeal to a child. He placed a bowl on the table and sat in the opposite corner of the room. Nalin approached the food slowly, watching him the entire time. She ate standing up, ready to run if needed. But she ate, and when she finished, she didn't retreat immediately. She stood by the table, looking at Thomas with something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't pure fear either. Calculation, maybe, trying to understand who he was and what he wanted. Thomas understood that calculation. He'd lived with it himself for years after the war, the constant assessment of whether people meant harm or help, whether safety was real or illusory. He knew what it felt like to be alone and vulnerable in a world that had proven itself dangerous. So he didn't push. He simply went about his evening routine, feeding the goats, collecting eggs from the hens, drawing water from the well. When he came back inside, Nalin was sitting on the bed again, wrapped in the blankets, watching the door. She didn't speak. Neither did he. If you're listening from somewhere beyond these frontier territories, leave a comment and let us know what city you're tuning in from. And if this story is drawing you in, hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring you more tales from the Old West, where impossible choices and quiet courage shaped the lives of those who refused to look away when someone needed help. Night came cold and fast. Thomas gave Nalin the bed and made himself a pallet on the floor near the fire. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathing, wondering what tomorrow would bring. He knew he couldn't keep her here indefinitely. She had family somewhere, people who would be searching for her, grieving her loss. But he also knew that finding them wouldn't be simple. The territory was vast, the Apache bands scattered and mobile, and tensions between settlers and natives were at a breaking point. Men on both sides were getting killed over misunderstandings, over territory, over old grievances that nobody could quite let go of. If Thomas rode into the wrong camp asking questions, he might not ride back out. And if he brought Nalin to the wrong people, soldiers or settlers who saw Apache as enemies first and humans second, she might end up worse off than when he'd found her. So Thomas lay on the hard floor and stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what the right thing was. He'd spent years after the war trying to avoid making decisions that affected other people's lives. He'd seen what happened when men with good intentions made bad choices. He'd been one of those men. The memories still came sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't hold. Faces of boys he'd led into battles they didn't survive, orders he'd followed that resulted in burning homes and scattered families. He'd thought coming out here, living alone, would mean he'd never have to carry that weight again. But here he was, responsible for a child's life, and every choice he made from here forward would matter. The fire burned low. Thomas added another log, watching the flames catch and spread. Across the room, Nalin slept, her breathing steady now, her small form barely visible under the mound of blankets. Thomas wondered what she'd seen, what she'd survived, how she'd ended up alone in that arroyo. He wondered if she had parents searching for her, siblings who missed her, a community that mourned her loss. He wondered if he'd live long enough to get her home. Morning came with the sound of horses. Thomas woke instantly, reaching for the rifle propped against the wall. Nalin was already awake, sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and alert. Thomas moved to the window, keeping to the side where he couldn't be seen. 5 riders approached slowly, spread out in a loose line. Apache warriors, their horses painted, rifles carried across their laps. They stopped 50 yards from the cabin and waited. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. They'd tracked the girl here. They knew she was inside. What happened next would determine whether Thomas lived or died, whether Nalin went home or became leverage in a conflict he wanted no part of. He looked back at the girl. She'd climbed out of bed and stood pressed against the wall, her small hands clenched into fists. She was terrified, but not of the warriors outside. She was terrified of what Thomas might do. He made his decision. Thomas set the rifle down, leaning it against the wall where it was visible but not in his hands. Then he walked to the door, opened it slowly, and stepped outside with his arms visible, palms open. The warriors watched him. None of them moved. Thomas gestured to the cabin, then made a motion with his hands, low to the ground, indicating a child. One of the warriors, older than the others with grey streaking his long hair, urged his horse forward a few steps. He said something in Apache, sharp and questioning. Thomas shook his head, not understanding, and gestured again to the cabin. Then he stepped aside, leaving the doorway open. For a long moment, nothing happened. The warriors sat motionless on their horses, tension radiating from them like heat. Then Nalin appeared in the doorway. She stood there, small and wrapped in Thomas's wool blanket, looking out at the warriors. One of them, a younger man on a spotted horse, made a sound, something between a cry and a gasp. He dismounted so fast he almost fell, running toward the cabin. Nalin ran too, meeting him halfway, and he swept her up in his arms, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. The other warriors dismounted, surrounding them, speaking rapidly in Apache. Thomas stayed where he was, hands still visible, watching. The reunion lasted several minutes, everyone talking at once, touching Nalin as if to confirm she was real, examining the cut on her head, asking questions she answered in a voice too quiet for Thomas to hear. Then the older warrior, clearly the leader, approached Thomas. He stopped 10 feet away, his expression unreadable. He looked Thomas up and down, assessing. Then he looked at the cabin, at the open door, at the rifle visible just inside. He looked back at Thomas and said something that sounded like a question. Thomas had no idea what was being asked, but he understood the weight behind it. This man wanted to know why. Why had Thomas helped the child? Why hadn't he used her as a hostage, a bargaining chip, or simply left her where he'd found her? Thomas had no words that would translate, no explanation that would make sense across the gulf of language and culture. So he did the only thing he could think of. He pointed at Nalin, then placed his hand over his heart. Then he pointed at the warriors, made a sweeping gesture that encompassed all of them, and repeated the motion, hand over heart. It was simple, inadequate, but it was true. The warrior studied him for a long time. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. He turned and spoke to the others. They began preparing to leave, helping Nalin onto the spotted horse with the young warrior who'd held her. But before they mounted up, the leader approached Thomas again. This time he reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something, holding it out. A small carved stone, smooth and oval, with symbols etched into its surface. Thomas took it carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palm. The warrior spoke, his tone formal, ceremonial. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. This was a debt acknowledged, a bond created. The warrior placed his fist over his heart, then extended his hand toward Thomas, palm down. Thomas mirrored the gesture. When their hands touched briefly, the warrior's grip was firm, his eyes direct. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and the group rode away. Thomas stood in his yard, holding the carved stone, watching them disappear into the hills. Nalin looked back once before they crested the ridge, her small hand raised in farewell. Then they were gone. Thomas went inside, suddenly exhausted. The cabin felt empty now, the bed unmade, the cup Nalin had used still sitting on the table. He sat down heavily in his chair and looked at the stone in his hand. The symbols meant nothing to him, but he traced them with his finger anyway, feeling the care that had gone into the carving. Someone had spent hours on this, maybe days. It was beautiful in its simplicity. He set it on the shelf above the fireplace, next to the few other objects he owned that mattered. A photograph of his mother, long dead. A pocket knife his father had given him. A letter from a friend who'd died at Antietam. Small things that marked the passage of a life, moments of connection in a world that so often felt disconnected. Thomas made coffee and sat drinking it, thinking about Nalin, wondering if she'd remember him, if she'd tell stories about the strange white man who'd given her water and cornbread and a warm place to sleep, wondering if her family would remember too. The answer came 3 days later. Thomas was working in the garden, pulling weeds that grew faster than the vegetables, when he heard horses again. He straightened, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. 2 riders this time, approaching slowly. Apache, but not the same warriors who'd come before. These men were older, their faces lined and weathered. They stopped at a respectful distance, and one of them called out in broken English, "Thomas Bridger." Thomas set down his tools and walked toward them, wiping dirt from his hands. "That's me." The warrior who'd spoken dismounted. He carried a bundle wrapped in hide, tied with leather cord. He approached Thomas and held it out. "From Nalin father," he said. "From Nalin people. You give back daughter. We give back respect." Thomas took the bundle, feeling the weight of it. "She's well? She made it home safely?" The warrior nodded. "She well. She tell story. How you find her. How you give food, give warmth, give safety. How you not take, only give." Thomas looked down at the bundle, not sure what to say. The warrior continued, his English halting but clear enough. "Nalin father say you are man of honor. He say if you ever need help you call. Apache will come." He pulled a strip of leather from his belt, decorated with small metal charms that caught the light. "You wear this. Any Apache see this, they know you are friend, they know you are protected." Thomas took the leather strip, feeling the charms slide against each other with a soft chiming sound. "I don't need payment," he said quietly. "I just did what anyone should do." The warrior shook his head. "Not anyone. Most white men, they see Apache child, they do not help. They leave to die, or they take to use as leverage. You did neither. You give back freely. That is why we give back freely." He gestured to the bundle. "Open." Thomas untied the leather cord and unwrapped the hide. Inside was a rifle, beautifully crafted, the stock inlaid with silver and turquoise. Next to it, a knife in a beaded sheath, the blade sharp and well-balanced, and beneath those, a stack of pelts, beaver and fox, soft and perfectly prepared. Thomas stared at the gifts, overwhelmed. "This is too much," he started, but the warrior cut him off. "It is not enough," he said firmly, "but it is what we have. Nalin father say he owe you life debt. This land, we are at war. White man take, Apache fight back. Both sides kill, both sides suffer. But you different. You choose life over death. You choose give back over take. That deserve respect. That deserve protection. He paused, choosing his words carefully. War still come. Soldiers still push us from land. Settlers still see us as enemy. But you, Thomas Bridger, you have friends now. You remember that. Thomas wrapped the gifts back up carefully, then looked at the warrior. Tell Nylin's father thank you. Tell him I'm glad she's home safe. Tell him that's all the payment I needed. The warrior smiled, a quick flash of teeth. I tell him, he already know. But gifts not just for you. Gifts are for his heart. He need to give, to balance what was taken, to honor what was returned. You understand? Thomas nodded slowly. He did understand. This wasn't about obligation or transaction. It was about restoring balance, about maintaining dignity in a world that tried to strip it away. The warrior remounted his horse. His companion, who hadn't spoken at all, nodded once to Thomas. Then they turned and rode away, disappearing into the hills as silently as they'd come. Thomas carried the bundle inside and unwrapped it again, laying the gifts out on his table. The rifle was a work of art, the kind of craftsmanship that took months to achieve. The knife was equally fine, its balance perfect. The pelts were worth more than Thomas earned in half a year. He ran his hand over the rifle stock, feeling the smooth inlay work. This was more than a gift. This was a statement. The Apache had resources, skills, power. They weren't the defeated, desperate people that settlers wanted to believe they were. They were a nation, proud and capable, and they'd chosen to honor Thomas in a way that reflected their strength. He placed the gifts on the shelf next to the carved stone, creating a small shrine to an unlikely friendship. Then he returned to his garden, to the mundane work of coaxing food from difficult soil. But something had shifted. The isolation he'd sought no longer felt quite so isolating. He'd acted without thinking, without considering consequences, simply doing what felt right. And in doing so, he'd created connections he hadn't known he needed. The weeks that followed were quieter. Thomas fell back into his routine, tending his garden, caring for his animals, repairing the endless small breakages that came with living alone in rough country. But occasionally he'd see signs that he wasn't as alone as he used to be. A deer haunch left at his door one morning, freshly killed and prepared. A warning scratched in the dirt near his well, symbols he couldn't read but understood, meant danger nearby. Once, he saw riders on a distant ridge, watching his cabin. When he raised his hand in greeting, they raised theirs in return, then disappeared. The Apache were keeping watch. They'd meant what they said about protection. Thomas wore the leather strip with the charms around his wrist, hidden under his sleeve most of the time, but present. A reminder that choices mattered, that small acts of decency could ripple outward in unexpected ways. One evening, as autumn began turning the high country golden red, Thomas sat on his porch watching the sunset. He thought about Nylin, wondered how tall she'd grown, whether she still remembered him. He thought about her father, a man he'd never met but felt connected to through the simple act of returning what was precious. He thought about the warriors who'd come to his door, bringing gifts and promises, creating bonds across a divide that most people said couldn't be crossed. The territory was still at war. Soldiers still marched west, pushing Apache off land that treaties said was theirs. Settlers still saw natives as obstacles to be removed. Violence still erupted with depressing regularity, bodies on both sides left to rot in the sun. But here, in this small clearing in the hills, Thomas Bridger had found something different. Not peace exactly, more like the possibility of peace. The understanding that enemies were often just strangers who'd never been given a chance to be anything else. Thomas went inside as darkness fell, lighting his lamp, preparing a simple dinner. The carved stone sat on its shelf, catching the lamplight. Next to it, the rifle and knife and pelts, evidence of a debt repaid and a friendship formed. Thomas ate his meal slowly, savouring the quiet. Tomorrow he'd work on the fence line that needed mending. He'd check on the goats, one of whom was getting close to kidding. He'd do all the small necessary tasks that made up a life on the frontier. But tonight, he simply sat and felt grateful. Grateful that he'd been in the right place at the right time. Grateful that he'd made the right choice, even when easier choices were available. Grateful that somewhere out there, a little girl was alive and well and home with her family because he'd chosen to help instead of ignore. It wasn't much. One child saved didn't stop a war. It didn't heal generations of mistrust and violence, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough. Thomas blew out the lamp and lay down on his bed, the same bed where Nalin had slept 3 weeks ago. He could still see her small form curled under the blankets, could still hear her tentative voice repeating his name, could still feel the weight of responsibility he'd carried, knowing her life depended on his choices. He'd made the right ones, not because he was particularly brave or good, but because anything else would have been unbearable. Thomas closed his eyes and let sleep take him. Outside, the night was full of sounds, wind in the pines, an owl calling, the distant yip of coyotes hunting in the hills, and somewhere, perhaps on a ridge nearby, perhaps in a camp many miles away, Apache people lived their lives, raised their children, fought their battles, and remembered the white man who'd given back what was precious. The frontier was vast and brutal, but it had room for moments of grace. Thomas Bridger had found one. He'd saved a child at dawn, and by nightfall the tribe had returned, not with violence, but with gratitude. They'd made a silent demand, not for payment or servitude, but for recognition. Recognition that humanity crossed cultural lines, that honor existed on both sides of a conflict, that sometimes the right choice was the simple one. Help when help is needed. Give back what doesn't belong to you. Treat others as you'd want to be treated if positions were reversed. Thomas had lived by those principles without thinking much about them. Now, lying in the dark, listening to the night, he understood that those principles had probably saved his life. The Apache could have come with violence. They could have seen his act as theft, as an attempt to manipulate or control, but they'd chosen to see it for what it was, a decent man doing a decent thing, and they'd responded in kind. That was worth more than any rifle, any knife, any stack of pelts. It was worth more than safety or protection or friendship, though those things mattered too. It was proof that even in the darkest times, even in the middle of a war that seemed to have no end and no winners, people could still choose to honor rather than hate, could still choose to give rather than take, could still choose to build bridges instead of walls. Thomas Bridger had saved an Apache child at dawn. By nightfall, he'd gained something he hadn't known he'd lost: hope. Not the naive kind that believes everything will work out fine. The harder kind that believes people can make things better even when the odds say they can't. That believes choices matter even when they seem small. That believes one act of decency can change the trajectory of lives in ways that ripple outward, touching people you'll never meet, creating possibilities that didn't exist before. He fell asleep with that thought, and when he woke the next morning to another day of hard work and simple living, he carried it with him. One child saved, one connection made, one moment of grace in a brutal world. It was enough.